Hi everyone, Jeremy here. Welcome to another episode of the Nightcast, where we stay up late outdoors at night. It's currently early July as I'm recording this, so it's a beautiful summer night, and we've got crickets and frogs and all the sounds of the dark chiming in. And this is an opportunity to let our minds loose a little bit, let them clear up at the end of the day, and discuss some ideas around the future of medicine. So that's the main central topic focus. But I have some things on my mind that I'm going to be sharing. We're going to be going around a lot of tangents, and I hope to provide pearls of wisdom that I've picked up, a lot of them from mentors, and pass them on to you in a way where it's threaded, where you can make some sense of this nonlinear practice management advice. And that's exactly where we're going to start, because tonight I'm giving advice on bad advice. Right? I understand, I get it. I know how crazy this sounds. But a lot of times mentors, teachers, peers, colleagues, people will give us advice that they would think is going to be helpful. And they're really trying to help us. But it's actually some of the most harmful information we could ever possibly digest. And most people are very well-meaning. Most people want to help each other, and especially help, practitioners that are relatively younger in the field. There's no shortage of advice. But I'm going to be breaking down not only some of it that I think is not really good advice from my own experience, but also how I frame that so that I know when it actually is good advice too, because guess what? Sometimes bad advice can be really good advice, and it goes the other way as well. There's the golden rule, right? Do unto others as you'd have others do unto you, which is like do nice things for people because you want to be treated nicely, right? This seems like common sense, and it's the foundation of natural law. But there's also the silver rule, which I really enjoy this concept, which is kind of the inverse of that, which is don't do unto others that which you would not want done to you, right? So not only can we add good to the world by following the golden rule, but we can also remove pain from the world by following the silver rule. And good, pain, pleasure, right? These kinds of biases drive human behavior, and they may sound like a lot of the same things, right? Oh, does somebody run from pain or run towards pleasure? Isn't it the same thing? It's not. These are wildly different motivations. So no matter what your purpose for following a healing path, there's going to be people who give you advice, and sometimes they think they're doing the golden rule and they really should be following the silver rule, and it has to do with bad advice. So I know I've introduced this well enough. Let's get right into it. There are different stages of growth for practitioners. Practice is not a linear thing, right? So I'm trained in Eastern medicine. That's where my background is. But this applies to basically any discipline, right? Anything you would call a practitioner, even things that aren't necessarily medical, like a practitioner of martial arts or a practitioner of a musical instrument, right? There's all kinds of practices we can have. This is the whole thing with like the do, right? Do. Any kind of Japanese art, like judo, right? Kyudo. These kinds of things. Cha-do, right? The art of tea. It's basically a long-term practice that requires cultivation. I think a lot of us are familiar with this idea, but what we don't always have very well articulated are the different steps along that path of development in an art, because it's not linear. It's not a straight line at all. In fact, it curves. I'd say for most of us, it's logarithmic, which basically means when you start out, you get a lot of early gains, and then that starts to kind of taper off and marginalize over time. So, a lot of people quit when it starts to get kind of boring. We can break this down into the honeymoon stage in the beginning, and then the long haul, right, for the whole rest of it. But basically, if your learning curve isn't rewarding very steeply, then you're probably starting to taper off into like more of a intermediate or advanced level, and it can be hard to keep going and follow things when your dopamine circuits are still programmed to respond to inputs and stimulus that's more appropriate for the first half of the curve. I know this is probably the kind of thing I should be talking about in a video so I can draw it, but here we are. It's nighttime, too dark for a video. That's why I'm doing Nightcasts, because this is when my house is quiet and the kids are asleep, except for the crickets and the frogs. So we have to understand what phase we're in, because that will help us get dopamine, right? Which is like the opposite of burnout. If you want to prevent burnout, it's a good idea to start to understand your own reward systems and what lights you up, right? But just know that the kinds of things that were good, great, fantastic ideas to get you from point A to point B in your practice, those may be the opposite things that are going to carry you from point B to point C. So along our journey, we have to be willing to learn new things, but also know when it's time to unlearn some of the things that served us very well. And I speak about this a fair amount, but I think our beliefs have to be flexible to get the best results in life. And by beliefs, I mean like belief systems. I don't necessarily mean like your principles or your guiding values around being a human. We can have integrity around that. We don't have to just like throw away our values and our morality and our principles. But what I mean by beliefs are more these kind of mental constructs we have around whatever condition of reality that we're currently accepting. And most people have beliefs that are subconscious. I know I still do, and I hunt them out, right? You can be very, very thorough with your own mind and like be vigilant and kind of focus on this stuff. And you'll still have subconscious things. That's the nature of the subconscious, right? We're not perfect. But we do want to explore the subconscious frames and lenses we've put around reality and what's good and what's our next step in our progress and in our growth. Because point A, when you're first starting out in practice and your schedule is empty and you're hungry and you just want to see more patients, like more, where can I get new patients, right? Point B is when you've gotten what you wanted and you now have a busy schedule or you have a waiting list or whatever it is. Like you're no longer hunting for more patients. You're now full and starting to feel some of the pressure of basically underdeveloped systems in your practice that start to bleed into your personal life. And what happens there, and I've been through this myself, is feeling the limit of this, is I call it being capped and being trapped, because we're capped in a model where we're selling our time for appointments, and we're trapped there because there's no way to work less and be able to kind of like go backwards in terms of responsibilities without taking a serious sacrifice in life. And I know I'm making this very binary. It's not necessarily that binary, but many of the patches that practitioners come up with when they hit this growth point, because it really is, it's pressure. It's like a hermit crab, right? That they outgrow the shell. And there's this, bit of time where you have a lot of pressure because your body doesn't fit in the shell anymore. So I'm sure it's uncomfortable to be a hermit crab that's outgrowing things, right? That's why they eventually cast it off. And a lot of ways that practitioners will do this is one of them is hiring, right? You hire somebody, you hire an associate, you hire whatever, you hire somebody to come in and add more hours to the day. Because if you're going to work 8, 10, 12 hours a day, that's it, right? But now you've got an associate or something who can put in another 6 or 8 hours or whatever it is. So now your clinic is functioning at 20-hour days or the equivalent, right? This is a great idea that brings a lot of benefits. Like one of them is to be able to mentor a newer practitioner, take somebody in under your wing because you're already kind of full. And this is somebody who's going to be at point A where they're like, I need more patients, right? And then you can take them in, you can kind of solve that. And there's some mutual symbiosis because we're working together at that point, right? The new practitioner gets experience. The more seasoned practitioner gets to make some extra income from the younger one's work and hours, right? And fair enough, because that's part of what you deserve after building a business and implementing systems to the point you have. It's a good relationship. It can work out. It depends on the quality of the people. Unfortunately, anytime you add a new person to your inner circle, it brings volatility and risk because people, even wonderful people, can sometimes turn into bad fits. So what this looks like is you hire a acupuncturist or, Eastern medicine person or functional medicine or whatever it is. You hire somebody to come work in your clinic and start helping more patients so that you can actually start to work a little bit less, get some of your time back. And it's great. This person's fantastic. They've got wonderful clinical skills. They've got awesome bedside manner. They're just a joy to be around. And 3 months into working for you, once they're properly trained and you finally invested the time and the extra energy to getting this person kind of up to speed with how things work and all that, 3 months in, they fall in love with somebody and have to move across the country. Or they decide they're going to take off for a spiritual 1-year retreat in Nepal or something, and they're just gone, right? And this is not anything malicious. It's not somebody coming in to try to poison your environment, but it is some of the volatility that is just part of the picture whenever we bring in other people to help take off some of the burden. And what's going on here is if we're selling time for money, we're going to get capped by that. And in order to try to break through the cap or in order to try to escape the trap, we can hire somebody and start selling some of their time for money, right? Which is totally fine. It's a good model. It works for a lot of people. I would say it's linear though, because you're still trapped in the whole time for money paradigm, which is what we're going to really explore around this topic tonight, is really about how to get out of time for money and go towards value-based compensation, financial alignment along with spiritual and ethical alignment, and how to merge all these things. It doesn't mean you have to take advantage of people or have prices that are just astronomical and insane, but it is a way to align your incentives with the incentives of the patient. So without giving away too much of the plot here, I'm going to go back to setting context, because hiring more people, even though that increases the amount of time you can sell during the day, you're still in the business of selling time, which I would say is a local capped, like a local maximum at best. We want to get to a higher hill, right, than the one we're currently at the peak of. Another piece of volatility that comes in is that some people actually are malicious. They're wolves in sheep's clothing. And this isn't something I'm making up, right? These are all things I hear from real practitioners that tell me about the situations that they've experienced or they currently are. And there are other times, especially if you get to be pretty well known for something or you're a standout with a specialty, you'll have practitioners coming in under the guise of coming to take some of the clinical strain off and allowing you to sell some of their hours. But really, what they're doing in the background is they're learning all of your processes, protocols, techniques, business systems, all that. They're getting to know your patient base. And 6 months after starting work for you, they're going to leave, open up a clinic down the street, literally 1 block away, and take half the patient base with them. Because there are some people like that too. And I know I want to believe in the best in people, but I've been let down by people I've met in the past, right? Some people are malicious. Some people it's an accident. It doesn't mean we have to harden our hearts and never hire anybody, never let anybody in. But it is one component that we need to be aware of when we start to look at, okay, I'm at point B now. I've got a busy practice. I've got abundance. I need to streamline this thing. How do we do that, right? One of them is bring in more people, bring in more hours. And there are some pros to that. There are some cons to that. So the whole thing is going to require a business model inversion, which I'm happy to say, I think some people are starting to kind of poke their heads up out of the water and look at this way to run their practices. Some people are doing experiments. It's not too common though. So I'm going to talk about it and I'm going to share my experiences of thinking this way and also some of the personal and psychological mindset challenges that I've gone through and that I think all of us are going to need to go through from cultural conditioning if you want to get to the other side of that. But first, I promised you bad advice, right? So I learned something from a mentor of mine many, many years ago, almost 20 years ago. And he had a story about advice, spiritual teachings, and how ultimately there is no spiritual truth, right? He heard this from a monk in a monastery. The monk said, there's no spiritual truth, right? And what that really means in that context is that all spiritual advice, all these things that are called spiritual truths, right? These like high-level thoughts that are very dense and very distilled down, but also make great inspirational quotes and just fodder up Instagram, right? Like these sacred things have now become mundane and just scroll food. But either way, there's still a lot of good truths, right? Wisdom. However, it's medicinal, which means it can be helpful, but also in the wrong dosage or for the wrong person with the wrong constitution, it could be actually harmful. What do I mean by that specifically? Well, think about a nice piece of advice you might read or see or hear. Think of others. Yeah, think of others. You need to think of others more, right? And this sounds like a nudge towards more caring, more kindness, more compassion, right? Getting outside of ourselves and our own limited frame on the world. It sounds like good advice, right? But what if you give that same advice to somebody who is kind of operating under a martyr complex, where they're always thinking of other people to the point where they neglect their own self-care, to the point where they don't sleep, they don't exercise, they don't eat right because they're so busy trying to make sure they take care of everyone else around them. Yeah. So to that person, the advice of you need to think more of other people is actually going to push them even further out of balance. In terms of if you're looking at Eastern medicine, we could be looking at like a 5-phase thing here with their earth, right? Or we could be looking at how are they meeting their needs? How are they meeting their emotional needs, but also their own biological needs, right? Because thinking of other people, helping other people, it's going to increase oxytocin, right? It's a way to start to feel good. A lot of times people are operating with subconscious needs and it's dictating their behavior, and they tell themselves a story about their personality, but really what's going on is that they're helping other people so that they could feel good inside, right? So they can get out of pain. How many of us have seen that with a patient, right? We get these patients with complex chronic health conditions, and this is a trap I've seen a lot of them fall down. I've helped a lot of people out of this, actually. It can be done, but you have to have these kinds of conversations with clarity and say, listen, here's what's going on. You've prioritized everybody but yourself. And it's not like you can just tell the person they have to change right then and there. Like, hey, you need to start prioritizing yourself instead. That makes sense, but it's not going to affect their subconscious. You need to go deeper and find out what needs they're meeting through that, and then find healthier ways to get those needs met, right? So that's part of the rapport. But anyway, one of those ways to intervene is not going to be saying, you need to think of others more, right? Because all these statements that sound great at first glance, they're actually just balancing statements, which means if somebody's too far in any one direction and you give them more of a nudge there, it's not going to be helpful. So if we think about practice and things that we learn from teachers and, people that are well-intentioned, right? But maybe they're capped by their own perspective as well. Nobody's perfect. We all have blind spots. But one of the worst pieces of advice I ever got, it gave me the heebie-jeebies, especially when people give you advice that they're really trying to give you the goods here, and it just doesn't jive with your worldview. But I had a supervisor in clinic, and he said, Jeremy, when you get into practice, you got to do the points, and you got to be good at your job. You got to be able to do the points, the herbs, and all that. But you also need to develop the skill of selling the next visit. And something about that just felt yucky inside when he said that. I was like, that sounds like a lot of strain, a lot of tension, a lot of mental bandwidth that, when you're a student, there's always the fear of, well, what if I get out and I just don't make it, or I'm not good, or I can't get patients no matter what, right? There's always those fears. We all have those fears. You can have those fears 10 years out. You can have those fears 30 years out. Right? It never goes away. You just get better at riding it, right? So even on a baseline of student level understanding with those fears of what happens when I graduate, and then here's somebody in a teaching position, an experienced practitioner who actually I learned a lot from and got along with really well, but that was the piece of advice, was you got to sell that next visit, sell the next visit, sell the next visit. And I kind of feel like underneath that, the energetics just didn't match, because it feels like now you're stringing the person along, right? I didn't have the language back then to articulate it, but what I can say right now is that he was giving advice, which is probably good for a point A practitioner starting out who's hungry and all that, but there are levels of development to go from point A to point B, right? It's not just A to B. There's going to be A.1, A.2, A.3 in the practitioner's development. And one of those development arcs, and it can happen at point B or later, but it's better if it happens before that, is understanding value-based pricing instead of selling appointments. Okay, and what we mean by that, and there are different ways to look at this. What we mean by that is that if somebody's going to invest money with you, right, the money is basically just a symbol of belief. Yes, money matters in the world. We buy things with it for survival. And, there's, of course, it's just as real as, as we make it, right? And it can be very real in the world, of course. But it also symbolizes belief, and it's one of the only ways to really have somebody's intent be shown through an action instead of just a word, especially with these longer term processes. So when someone wants to work with you, they want to go on a transformative journey, they want you to help them solve a problem, whatever it is, to help you reach a goal, it doesn't matter, right? There's got to be a threshold of belief that you can actually help them do that thing, right? Or some other need is going to be met in order for money to move. Right. We have to understand that money's a byproduct, just like when we say, oh, how do I get successful and all that? Well, you do good work and you help people and you deliver value, and money comes along with that as almost an afterthought. Right. But you do have to develop business systems around this stuff. You do. You want to have good offers. You want to have good structures. You want to have systems in place so that your business side of your business runs like a business. Right. So money symbolizes belief, symbolizes intent. And you can attach the money and the value to the service you provide or the result you deliver, right? Or both. Or you maybe want to learn how to navigate this where you can have different kinds of conversations with different people who have different value systems, right? So maybe you have a couple different offers at your clinic that reflect that. I'll get into specific examples, right? But basically, there's the result you provide, which is, let's just say we've got a patient who has fibromyalgia or mold exposure or Lyme disease or something like that, long haulers, right? And they've been so sick that their energy's just toast. They barely can get out of bed. They feel like they're just slowly dying, and they're in their like mid 40s, mid 50s, right? They're nowhere near old enough to feel that old. Always inflamed, can't do anything, missing out on life like crazy. I mean, how many patients have you had like this? I mean, I specialize in this area because we can make such dramatic transformations for people who are stuck in such a like catch-22 vicious cycle, right? We can actually successfully interrupt that for a lot of cases. And it's a dramatic transformation. It's really cool to help people like get back to life. It's really cool. So someone gets in that kind of situation, there's all kinds of pain, suffering, misery, and like cost associated with that, right? Especially somebody who can't work. Now you've got a person who was bringing in $50,000 or $80,000 or $250,000 a year or more for their family. And now they got hit with chronic fatigue syndrome or whatever it is, reactivated Epstein-Barr, and they had to quit their job. Can't do it, right? So every year that person stays sick, they're losing income like crazy. It can be very expensive. And then you add on top of that all the payouts for like crutches, basically things that are just kind of getting them through the day or some kind of painkiller or whatever it is. And then also having to pay for people to come do things around their house that they used to be able to do themselves, right? Like now you got to pay somebody to mow your lawn or do your gardening or whatever because you literally can't get out of bed 6 days out of the week, right? So there's stuff you can quantify, and then there's other stuff that's just quality of life stuff. But however you slice it, I mean, there's a big cost to that. It's a big cost. So if we can help that, if we can alleviate that, you can be valuing your services based on the result you provide, which is getting rid of that cost to that person, right? Emotionally, energetically, financially, like all of it, spiritually, relationship wise, like getting rid of all those drains. It's a massive value add, right? Or you could focus on the work you do to achieve that result. You could focus on the acupuncture treatment or the time it takes you to look up an herb formula or whatever it is, right? We inherit a lot of subconscious programming from our environment, and I call them training glitches. And it's basically, it happens a lot of times when we're in a training environment, like a school, studying Eastern medicine or whatever it is. We're very impressionable, and we pick up conscious lessons, but we also pick up subconscious patterns and different beliefs, right? Like I said, we want to have flexible beliefs so that as we move through the stages of practitioner development, we know which ones to shed, right? Like if you're in a kayak going across a river, that kayak's your belief system, right? And then you get to the other side and now there's dry land and you want to go climb a mountain and get a view for the morning. You don't want to drag that kayak up the mountain. You need to be able to park it down by the river, right? And get out of it and be flexible and be free. And a lot of it, that's our beliefs, right? But if you don't know you're in a kayak in the first place, how are you ever supposed to get out of it? So part of our little mission here is to start looking at some of these subconscious patterns we picked up, some of the bad advice we've gotten from people who are well-intentioned, right? Misplaced advice. And we also look at other things we assume. If you start out in a student clinic and patients are coming in paying per treatment, then you inherit a pay per treatment model by default, right? Unless you kind of break out of that, that's going to become the status quo. This and like 10,000 other things that we all pick up. And it's a big part of my work is to kind of systematically take everything back down to first principles and go, okay, well, why do I do it this way? Why do I do it that way? Why did they do it this way, right? What did they know that I didn't know? I don't want to break a system until I understand it, right? These kinds of things. You got to be really thorough with your thinking. But there's also a lot of playfulness and a lot of fun you can have by changing up some of these things. And some of it too has a really cool effect because when you do things differently than the status quo, right? In terms of your systems and your pricing and how you deliver care or whatever, most likely you also deliver the actual medicine with a different lens as well. So people are they'll feel that, right? People feel it. They go, wow, things are different here. You do things different. Yeah, I do a lot of things different. You've done the same before. It didn't work. And now you're here. So let's take it from a whole different level. that's a good thing, right? As long as you're consistent there. So we can play with this stuff. We can bring in new models into our practice, and it can be fun. It can also be scary, but it can be fun. So charging for the results you deliver as opposed to charging for the services you provide. We tend to come into practice charging for the services we provide. It makes more sense. It's easier for us to measure, right? Because I can say, well, 1 hour is one appointment, which also needs to be, we can break that because it doesn't take an hour to do an appointment, right? 1 hour, one appointment, 1 hourly rate. That is your fee for appointment, right? That makes sense from our side, from the practitioner's side. From the patient side, though, they don't really care about what an appointment costs. Okay. And I should actually qualify that, because patients who want to stick around, the good patients that are like long-term and aren't just going to see you once and flake off, they want to know what an appointment costs. But what they really want to know is what's the cost going to be in terms of not only finances, but also the frequency of treatments, like their attention and their time, right, to follow this path with you. What are these costs going to be long-term? They want to know what the result is going to be, right? What's it going to take? So if somebody, for example, a fertility patient, right, they want to get pregnant, they don't really want one acupuncture treatment. They want enough acupuncture treatments to get the job done, right? They don't want one glass of herbs. They want to go on an herbal protocol and a regimen that's going to help them get pregnant, right? So if you put yourself in the position of your patients or your clients or your members or however your relationship is, you can see the golden rule and you can see the silver rule kind of coming into effect. So for me right now, I'm on the other side of this. I'm hiring a developer to make some software, some clinical clarity software that I think is going to revolutionize the field of Eastern medicine, which is pretty exciting. And that's about all I can say about that right now. But I'm in the process of hiring a developer, and I have certain benchmarks, certain jobs that I want done. I want certain product levels of completion, and I know what those are. And as I'm interviewing different developers around the world, a lot of them are attached to the hourly rate, right? Oh, well, this is my hourly rate. Okay, well, great. I don't really care what your hourly rate is because I don't know how much work you can get done in an hour, right? So if it's going to be, here's my goal for you. Here's the deliverables. Here's what you're going to be making. And, they say, oh, my hourly rate is, right, whatever. Okay, wonderful. But how many hours is it going to take? Is this a 10-hour job? Is this a 1,000-hour job? Like, what's going on here? You have specialized knowledge I don't have, which is why I'm hiring this out in the first place. So you also have to help me understand this whole process, right? Because I don't want 1 hour of a developer's time at all. I want a developer to help me build something beautiful and have it functional, right? So I'm approaching this from the position now of, right, the client coming in. And you got to remember, because it's so easy to forget, right? Like, how many times have you had somebody on your table, right? Metaphorically or literally, your treatment table, versus how many times have you been on one? Right? It's incredibly weighted in terms of you see way more patients than the times you've ever been a patient, right? So it's good to sometimes get in that other role and go be a patient somewhere, right? Go get a massage, go get a treatment, go see a chiropractor, go whatever, and just be on the receiving end of some care. If for nothing else, then to just keep your mind fresh about what everybody you help is experiencing, right? Because now you're being in their shoes. And this is how we get empathy, right? This is one of these things. And then we can start to apply the golden rule and the silver rule and go, wow, when I'm in this position, I don't want to hear about somebody's hourly rate, because my real question, right? That's just a reduced question. Well, what's your hourly rate? How much is a session? How long are the sessions, right? Those are good questions. But the real questions going on is like, can you help me? If so, what's the bottom line going to be here? Working with you. How much is this going to cost? What's your kind of probability of success? And then they make a judgment, a determination about following a path with you, right? So that's how I like to be treated as a client. So that's how I like to treat my clients, right? That's how I like to pass it on. Now, the trick with the golden rule and the silver rule is that there's an underlying assumption there, right? Treat other people how you want to be treated. Don't do things to other people that you wouldn't want done to you, right? But the underlying assumption is actually projection. We're projecting our own preferences onto other people, right? I want to treat you how I'd want to be treated. Well, we're nothing alike, right? And this is just like the advice. It can be medicinal or it can be poison. However, we're taking the golden rule and the silver rule and we're applying them in our practice, which means we can actually do the projection if we want, because it's going to become a point of manifestation. It's going to become a market differentiator, right? So if I know that I'm the kind of person who wants to come in, I see a high ticket price, it doesn't scare me because I'm looking at a process, right? I don't want to see what's one appointment or 1 hour of a developer's time. I want to see the actual end of the day, right? I want to see the value delivered and what they're asking me in terms of compensation. And I want to make a decision on that, right? That's the kind of thinker I am. That's the kind of person I am. Those are also the kind of people I work best with. So it's okay if I project, right, onto my, like they call in the business coaching world, like your avatar, right? There's actually 4 avatars. Nobody ever, like, I've only seen a couple people ever talk about them, but even then it's usually like the first 1 and 2. But there's really 4 avatars, right? So the one they mostly talk about with business coaching is your first avatar, which is like your ideal client, your ideal customer. I'm going to project my values all over that ideal customer if they're the kind of values that I like working with, right? So for example, long-term thinking, commitment, understanding that there's going to be short-term suffering in some capacity, but if done correctly, if invested correctly, that energy will yield long-term results that you couldn't have gotten otherwise, right? I'm patient. I'm deliberate, right? I like that. I like that in patience, but also, I'm quirky and kind of weird, and I think I'm funny, right? But so I like to be around patients that are like that too. They have a sense of humor, right? And they can kind of see, I don't know, the dark side of life and still kind of look and laugh. I've still got a decent thread of sarcasm woven into my personality, and I enjoy it. I'll get rid of it one day, but currently I enjoy it, and I enjoy it with other people too. I think it's a nice way to bond. So I like funny people that are also based in reality and have a spine, right? It's a balance. So I don't mind projecting that onto my avatar, if you want to call it that, by using the golden rule. And how this comes out is systems design, right? So when you set up your offer structure, when you're sitting down with a new patient in a consultation and you're doing all the things in a consultation that you should do, right? Like you're connecting with the patient and actually caring about what's going on with them. You're listening. There's kind of the doctor brain is like listening analytically and taking all the symptoms and stuff and doing all the like magic math that helps us figure out a diagnosis and a treatment plan, right? You're doing all these things, figuring out if it's going to be a good clinical fit. And also at the same time, educating the patient and helping them see their problem in a new way, helping them understand what it is you do, how it's different than what they've tried before, right? If it is. And the patient eventually is like, okay, great. Sounds good. I don't have any other questions. I want to do this. My only question is like, how do we do this? What does this cost? And at that point, if you don't have offers created that come from the right kind of architecture, you're going to wind up reinforcing a system that is going to keep you capped and trapped. So what I mean by that is we'll just be surfing on training glitches. So when they say, well, okay, so how do we do this? And you say, well, okay, the appointments are $150 a session and they take 45 minutes and that's it. They're left like kind of head scratching, like, okay, I guess I'll just kind of keep inserting coin at every appointment and just playing this game as long as I can, right? Or another level to this would be like, okay, here's your prognosis. Most cases like this tend to start responding by visit 4 to 6. For these kinds of cases, you should plan on doing 10 to 12 treatments over the next 4 weeks or whatever it is, right? If you have a plan, you would communicate that plan. They can then look and go, okay, well, there's the amount of treatments that you're recommending for your plan. We can reassess at that point. Here's the criteria we're going to use to reassess. What's the rate per session? Multiply it out. Like, okay, this is what's going to cost to get to that point with you and treatment. And they can kind of start to like figure out kind of a total, right? At that point, that's good. You've got prognosis. You can see into the future a little bit. There's a lot of benefits to this. I like it. It's good. It's in the right direction, right? Because what we're doing right there is we're already outgrowing. Remember I said there's like point A1, point A2, point A3. We're already outgrowing that advice I got back in student clinic of always sell the next appointment. No, not at all. I don't want to be at visit 3 trying to convince somebody that they're going to need visit 4. And then when visit 4 comes, I have to convince them they're going to need visit 5. It's so much better for everybody involved, in my opinion, to sit back in the beginning and project out at least a dozen visits, right? For most cases. and use your clinical discretion, right? I mean, some things really only need like 3 treatments, so don't tell them 12, right? But, be realistic. But anyway, it's way better. You've got so much more leverage to do the effort of helping somebody see what you can see in terms of how many visits they're going to need. Do that up front once. Get them on board, right? I think it's more work to sell 12 visits one at a time than to just stand next to somebody shoulder to shoulder and say, like, listen, this is where you are. To get you to the next point, this is probably what it's going to take, right? Give or take a few treatments. It's so much easier, right? And what kind of experience are you showing now? So you want to be able to move through these things. And this is what I mean about like outgrowing beliefs, or taking the kayak and parking it down by the river. Like this whole thing of, I got to sell more visits. It's a belief. It's conditional, right? It's contingent. Now, the next bit is, well, what if we don't sell appointments at all? And I know I speak about this regularly, and I like to do it because it's a good thought experiment, and actually you can bring this to life if you want. It can become much more tangible than just a thought experiment. But getting rid of appointments, changing around a lot of pieces of your systems, right? Whether you're working online or brick and mortar or both or whatever, there's different ways to apply this stuff. You can be creative. I've done a lot of variations of this. But one thing is just a membership, like a time-based membership. I know some practitioners are doing this. If a patient says, well, how much is the treatment? Well, we have actually monthly memberships where it's X amount of dollars, and that includes up to, 15, 20, 30 treatments a month, whatever you want to do, right? You create it so that when somebody's in a point of their healing phase where they need high intensity, high frequency treatments, you can accommodate that for just a bulk rate. And then maybe you have different plans, like, we've got also this other plans like monthly maintenance, and there's access to certain herbs or something. Like you can have member perks built in. It's really cool. You can start to build a club that way. And then you got somebody at a different point in their healing process where they could just use a tune-up once a month. Maybe you got something in the middle for people who only need to come, 3 or 4 times in a month. And you can kind of phase people onto their monthly frequency plans. What just happened there is you're no longer selling appointments, right? Now you're looking at time span memberships. It's a different model. There is no way that advice I got in the student clinic back in the day about, make sure you're always selling the next appointment. There is no way that applies when you don't even have appointments to sell, right? And I knew there was a reason. It's like you feel squiggy about it. But what are you going to do about that, right? You have to develop better systems so that you can get off that little hill where that actually is good advice, right? Because if you're selling appointment, that is good advice. If you don't have a treatment plan, you don't have prognosis, right? And you didn't create that communication in the beginning with the patient, then sell the next appointment is great advice, right? But we need to evolve up and out of that. And I'm just picking on this one piece of advice. Like pretty much everything that is out there in terms of advice is relevant in the context in which it's relevant. And then if you can expand that context and then create new systems around that, you're playing in a different dimension, and that advice is just gone. It's just gone. It's no different than saying, you got to think of other people more, to somebody who's martyring themselves for oxytocin all day long, right? Like you're going to poison them. That person's in a different dimension. It's not going to work right. And it goes the other way too. So when we start looking at our offer structures and how we do this, there's like the technical, intellectual understanding of this. And then there's also the emotional stuff that goes on, because guess what? A lot of us come from a Western culture with a Protestant work ethic, and time for money makes sense. It's just kind of the default. You get your first job. I mean, I was working in high school, hourly rate, right? Always. It's like, well, what do you make per hour? And there's like a minimum wage per hour of someone has legislated and decided what the time, right? What the tiny intervals of your life are worth at a minimum. So I know that a lot of people work hourly rate jobs. I'm not putting that down. I think it's a good thing in the right context. What I'm going to offer is that for practitioners, if you have a long-term process in place, you may want to consider getting out of the hourly rate model, or at the very least having a hybrid option. And I'll share with you some of that as well in just a moment. So same thing with a coder, developer. I really don't want the hourly rate person. And I've rejected some because they just insist on being hourly. And I'm like, that's incentivized you to drag this project on, right? Whether you know it or not, your financial incentives are running totally counter to my incentives as a client and what kind of value I want to create. So the same conversation is going on in your patient's mind, right? Whether they're on board or they're really cynical or skeptical, it doesn't matter. You still want to be able to answer the question of like, how do I know you're not just trying to sell me more appointments, right? Because that advice I got in student clinic, that's really basic. I don't want to be that kind of practitioner. I don't want to be that kind of business person. I don't want to be that kind of human, right? Where my incentives are misaligned. And that's part of why I think it felt yucky inside. I didn't have the language for this, but I've articulated this now. I've figured it out. And that's a lot of what it is. There's an invisible conversation happening in every single person's subconscious, like all the time, especially when they meet new people, especially when they're thinking about risk reward and trying to assess the volatility of a new situation, making a decision, right? There's a lot of this subconscious chatter, and they're trying to categorize you. They're trying to put you in a box. They're trying to mark you as safe or not safe. And, if not safe, these are the risks, and we all do it. It's happening. So you may as well pay attention to it. You may as well be aware of it. And then we can start to grow as people, but also into different systems where we can shine as these new versions of ourselves that aren't constrained and aren't limited by the temptation to have misaligned incentives, right? And what that brings. So what do I mean by misaligned incentives? It's just like I said, a patient might say, well, okay, it's $150 per visit. So it's in your best interest financially to sell me as many visits as possible, right? Next visit, next visit, next visit. I would rather pay for the result, right? Give me a timeline, right? That kind of thing. The practitioner has two options, right? One is to just be outside of that model entirely, like I mentioned. Another one is to realize that the incentives are only misaligned in the short term, right? And of course, we need to become longer term thinkers. Short term doesn't mean today and tomorrow, right? Short term is like 6 months at a minimum. Because guess what? 6 months goes by pretty quick, actually. When we start thinking long term, it's a year at a minimum, 5 years, 10 years, right? These are longer term plans. So if we consider the short term as like 3 to 6 months, something like that, that's the danger zone, right? Because if a practitioner wants to just be charging and making as much money and running people through a mill where they sell as many appointments as possible, right? And overtreat, oversell, all that, they can kind of get away with that for a few months, right? But then the person's just going to go, fuck this, I'm out of here, right? And what else happens with that? There goes the goodwill. There goes the referrals. Yeah, so short term, you can make a ton of money, jacking people into your office as frequently as possible and all this, trying to kind of like get the hooks in. Long term, it's going to constantly erode whatever base of community you're touching, right? Which means the money will go down. Everything will go down, right? So it's much better to think longer term and go, okay, there's a big risk to even act like that. So it's actually in your best interest, even if you are selling appointments, like time for money, it's in your best interest to still get people as much value as possible, get them better as quickly as you can with the minimal amount of interventions and the minimal amount of expense, right? Less appointments. If you can do it in 12 appointments, but you can also do it in 3, do it in 3, right? And of course, with medicine, there's a lot of other variables besides the treatments, because there's the patient's body and everything else that they're doing with it and with their mind, what kind of constitution they have, how long they've had the problem, right? All the things that are going on in their life that you can't control. So I understand that it's like, not everybody's going to have 3 visits and get the same results, but regardless, you want to understand that you're aligned long-term to being able to help people now as well as you can, because they're going to be so blown away that here comes the referrals, right? Here comes the positive network effects. Here comes the exponential coefficients where one person refers more than one person, right? Basically, as soon as you have a ratio that's higher than 1 to 1, you're going somewhere, right? So if you've got one patient can refer 3 patients, 4 patients, 9 patients, whatever it is, this is how your practice grows exponentially, and it grows on goodwill and it grows organically. And the kinds of people that you're going to be able to encounter will tend to have similar value systems in terms of how they show up in the world, what their preferences are. I mean, you're going to have a lot of diversity in your practice, but there'll also be some commonalities. Like for me, I noticed that the people that I had really good rapport with who came in as patients and we would laugh and they're funny. Like the people that they referred in also had pretty good senses of humor. You see, so you get this kind of inbuilt fractalized consistency when you're getting these like organic things versus just kind of grabbing people off Google ads, just whoever's scrolling, right? So you want to think long term, which means even if a patient says, if it came down to it and they actually articulated what their subconscious was already thinking, but if they say, hey, aren't you incentivized to drag this out and get more money from me for this problem? You can actually say, like, short term, yeah, that would make sense, but I'm here for long term, and long term, it's way more lucrative, actually. I'm financially aligned to get you better as quickly as possible because it's going to knock your fucking socks off, and you're going to be telling everybody to come in here. So I'm building a practice, I'm building a presence, I'm building connection, right? Money follows. I'm more aligned to long term. But you need to understand that, otherwise you'll fall into the trap of like, well, it's just going to take this many visits because that's what I said, and whatever. Like, you need to understand your context in terms of like what hill you're standing on. Are you standing on a hill of where you even understand short term and long term or not? And once you do, you can speak from that, and people really appreciate that. They really do. So same thing when I'm in the shoes of the client, right? When I'm looking for a professional to help me with something, I want to find out if they understand that, right? I want to see what kind of long-term relationship we could be working on and see if there's something there worth cultivating and make sure they understand that, because then there's a lot less chance that they're going to screw around and try to like just do weird stuff in the beginning to get that quick buck, right? If they can see a long-term potential working with you, then it's like, yes, we're smart. Yes, we're caring, but also the deep subconscious primal fears that everybody has, right? That amygdala and all this stuff going off in our brains can actually be calmed down and aligned, right? The financial alignment is right there with the energetic alignment, right? Because the patient wants to get better as quickly as possible. And now financially, you're incentivized to get them better as quickly as possible, because long-term, that means a sustainable business, right? So this is how we start to get around these paradoxes. And the next bit that I'll tell you is that you want to start to understand people's value systems. And this is a mistake that I made at a certain point in my practice when I really started to make this shift and go more towards value-based and like delivering relief, right? Actually, I don't want to say solve the problem or cure the disease, like something so extreme, but basically, like, what kind of relief can we get? What's the progress marker? Like, where's the impact? And if I know that it's a condition like it's fibromyalgia or Lyme or mold or one of these gnarly things, I know that for 99.5% of people, it's not going to be a magic wand, right? It's not going to be a 1 visit, 2 visit kind of thing. It's going to be a longer term process, a year at the minimum, of intervening with the person's body to get them set up so that after this fresh start, they can actually do what needs to be done to maintain their health, right? A year at a minimum. I mean, I've worked with patients for years and years and years. I mean, a lot of practitioners probably have these patients that are like long-term patients, and it's not a prison sentence, right? They're coming in because they're actually committed, and they're seeing marked changes from year 1, year 2, year 3. Like they're feeling it. They're feeling the benefits, right? They don't come in because they're trapped. They come in periodically, semi-regularly, right? They take herbs here and there because they're in a maintenance phase or whatever, but they're never totally out of touch with your world because you saved their life, right? These are long-term cases. So when I first started thinking this way, I made a big shift, and I said, okay, I'm not taking any cases like this unless the person's ready to commit to a long-term process. There's a fee for that. All this stuff was kind of packaged up. And I had patients come in, and some of them weren't mentally aligned, emotionally aligned to that kind of long-term commitment, right? For them, I was still too risky, right? They weren't sure. They needed more certainty in either myself, my methods, their ability to follow through, right? All kinds of variables come into play. That's a conversation for another day. But I found that people were not wanting that. Some people, actually a lot of people really loved it, because I was like, listen, you got to be committed. You got to like get in here and know that this is a long-term process. And I had a lot of patients who were like, hell yeah, I get it. Sign me up, right? Swipe my card, book out my appointments. At the time too, I had like an online program I was supplementing the brick and mortar with. And they're like, get me in the program. Like everything was just clicking, right? But there were a few patients that would come in and they were like, I don't want to commit to anything. And for a minute, it just broke my brain, because I was very black and white about it. But I've since understood more gradient and more nuance around that is that, again, I was projecting. This is why I'm talking about golden rule and projection, all that. I was projecting my own values onto people in terms of strategically how I like to be as a client and how I like to have this idea of kind of higher ticket pricing with a longer term lens, right? I didn't need to project that onto people all the time. And for some people, it didn't fit their value system or how they look at money, right? They don't look at money in terms of results. They look at money in terms of work and effort. So they want to see the appointments, right? But that doesn't make them bad people or wrong people. And actually, I was working with some people I had those kinds of conversations with, and I had to learn and grow and figure this out. But I wound up working with some of those folks. And I mean, we had a great time. They were great patients, but they really wanted to be like a pay by visit kind of patient, right? Which is totally fine. And I know there's different reasons. Like sometimes people are like, listen, I just don't have the cash liquidity to prepay for this or to do whatever. Like, I get it. There's tons of different reasons. I'm kind of just, as you can tell, I'm all over the place. I've got a web of nonlinear ideas that are all threaded together. So I'm going to try to cut like some of these tangents down. But just because somebody wants to pay as they go, or they don't want to do a buy-in or something like that of this, by buy-in, I mean like mentally being bought into this long-term process. It doesn't mean they're bad patients. It doesn't mean they're going to fail. It doesn't mean they're bad fits even, especially if your systems can adapt. Like, why is it one or the other? Oh, I'm going to sell visits. Okay, no, I'm not going to sell visits. I'm going to sell packages of visits. Okay, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to sell memberships. And I know I present these things as distinct ideas, but who says you can't have multiple offers going on? Right? You can have packages and pay-as-you-go option and a membership option. You can put all these things. A lot of times practitioners get scared to try new ideas because they feel like they're going to give up something that they have that's working. They go, well, if I stop selling appointments, then I'm going to just, what if this doesn't work? Then I lose out on all these new patients that would have been good for my old model. Great. Have them both. Just, you do the testing, you do the split testing, and you just say, yeah, here, great. Here's our consultation's basically over. I've heard your problem. I understand it. I asked some clarifying questions. I've got some good rapport going on. I'm interested in your case. You know that I can help you. You understand my methods. And then the patient's like, okay, how do we do this? You go, well, we got two different ways you can go. You can do pay as you go, or here's the package that might make more sense in your case. It's up to you, right? Or, oh, we have three different things. We've got pay as you go. We've got these packages you can do. And then we also have this other model that a lot of people really like, which is monthly memberships or annual memberships or an annual program, right? I mean, I've had these literal conversations in my office with real people, plenty, where you give people options like that. And I know they say, if a prospect's confused, they won't buy anything from you. Like, this is business advice, right? But this is also not necessarily true when you're at this level of development, because you're not going to confuse your prospective patient. You're going to be there with the options, and you're going to help guide them and help them figure out what they need. They're not going to be confused. If they leave your office confused, you mess something up, right? You gotta be there and don't confuse them. But you can have multiple offers. You can have multiple doorways within which they can really walk to interact with you in your world. And that's okay. And you can test them. And you can see what you like. You can see what you don't like. You can hybridize this thing, and you can really start to get the most of it. And you might find that you really like this monthly membership model or annual membership model, like on your end. It's great. You don't have to keep track of their treatments. You don't have to worry about if they miss an appointment or whatever, depending on how you got it set up. Like, it can be quite liberating. And then maybe you start to let other offers go. Like, oh, we don't do pay as you go anymore. We don't do packages anymore. Or yeah, we used to do monthly memberships, but for us, it didn't actually work out that well. So we stopped that. And as soon as, the current people's memberships expire, we're not renewing it. We're going back to pay as you go, whatever it is. You can have these options. So you can not only treat people how you want to be treated with the golden rule, but you can also treat people how they want to be treated, right? Which is maybe, let's call it the platinum rule. Can we do that? Treat people how they want to be treated. Something that fits their incentives, right? Their subconscious imbalances of who they are, the archetypes they play. Like, meet them where they're at. And sometimes that looks like, in business terms, to be pragmatic and practical, it looks like having just a parallel offer structures. And you don't pick like, oh, this person doesn't look like they have any money, so I'm going to give them this offer. No, you don't do any of that stuff. You let them pick. You empower them with the information, and you treat people like mature, sovereign adults, and you let them make a decision. right? So don't pick for them, because that's condescending, and that can be really insulting. And it's also predatory, because if you see somebody who looks like they have a bunch of money and you try to put them on your highest ticket thing all the time, I mean, just help the people, right? This can be pretty simple. So there's some of the pragmatic advice, right? I know it's a dangerous word because we're talking about bad advice. So take this for kind of where you are in your practice. This might be horrible advice for where you are in your practice. However, a lot of practitioners that I interact with are somewhere point A, point B, right? It's either you've got an empty practice that you're trying to fill up, or it's starting to fill up and now you're getting kind of more evolved systems, and then you're at like proper point B where the practice is swollen and you're feeling the pressure, and then you're starting to kind of try to figure out other solutions, like hire somebody, right? I really like go online. That's like my big one for that. That's where we get nonlinear, but that's also a conversation for a different day. So these are all kind of technical ideas, right, about how to start shifting from fee for service to fee for value, right? That's great, but there's also our own internal emotional growth and our own self-sabotage and our own mindset around that. As I mentioned before, a lot of us were raised in this Protestant work ethic culture. My first job was like time for money, hourly rate. It's a world we come from. And also, just so you know, the fact that we shift out of that to a different dimension of offer, like instead of selling our time, we can sell memberships or results or whatever it is. That doesn't mean we look down our nose at time for money or people who still work in that. Like maybe you have a sibling or one of your kids or your best friend or a mentor of yours, right? Because we can get mentors in all different places, and they're working an hourly job somewhere. That doesn't mean that they're like a loser or something. So we need to get out of this binary thing too. Just because, I say things like it's a different dimension, right? It is. It's a different dimension, but it doesn't mean it's better or worse necessarily. And it sure doesn't mean the people who occupy that dimension are better or worse people, right? That would be a mistake to start to believe that as well. So I do believe that we can make this change. We can make this transition from time for money, which is kind of just ingrained in us, to value-based pricing. And then delivering that, I think on the practitioner side, it really sets us free to do our best work. It's amazing. And on the patient side, I think a lot of patients, from my experience and the experience of some of the practitioners that I've shared these things with, it seems like a lot of patients really like this model too, because it gets all the bullshit out of the way and they just know what they're in for. And at the same time, we have to be ready to emotionally become that different version of ourselves, because change can be scary, even positive change. So thanks for staying up. Until next time.